2 o'clock. Roll call, please.
Representatives, please state your name for the record when I call the taxing district you represent. City of DeKalb.
Here. Bill Nicholas.
DeKalb Public Library. DeKalb Township.
Jennifer Jeep Johnson.
DeKalb Township Road and Bridge District.
Craig Smith.
DeKalb Community Unit School District 428.
Jamie Craven.
DeKalb County Forest Preserve. DeKalb County.
Gary Hansen.
DeKalb Park District.
Amy Dahl.
Kishwaukee Water Reclamation District.
Mark Eddington.
Kishwaukee College.
Bob Johnson.
Public Member.
Tim Hayes.
I would like to remind everyone here that we have speaker request forms up here on the table if you wish to address the Joint Review Board. Moving to public participation, letter item C. We do have one form that has been turned in. Jerry Smith.
Would you like me to do that now?
Jamie, the
I'm sorry.
minutes. There's the item C on my agenda is minutes.
Oh, I have a different one.
There was a new one handed out.
Okay, my apologies. I was working off the wrong agenda. Item C is approval of minutes. We have minutes from the JRB meeting August 7th, 2019, minutes from JRB meeting September 4th, 2019, and minutes from November 9, 2019. Should those be 18? We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Now, item D, public participation. Jerry Smith.
I'd make a smart aleck remark about being ruled out of order, but I wouldn't do that. Jerry Smith, Mayor, City of DeKalb. I simply wanted to review something. I'm sure most of the JRB members are aware of this, but this is the last day in the City of DeKalb for Jason Michnick as one of our employees. And I just want to publicly acknowledge Jason's participation in the entire TIF arena over the past several years. He's been my go-to guy when I had a question all too often about TIF, and I appreciate it. Jason, as you know, is going to be going to a position in Tanzania development support and international development, a true passion of his. It'll be a full-time position, the first time that organization has had that position. We wish him well. This is his last day in the office. I just asked him, do you have everything done now? And he succinctly said, nope. So again, I just wanted to take this opportunity, Chairman Craven, to, on behalf of the city, thank Jason Michnick for his work for the city on TIF. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and certainly good luck. Sounds exciting. We also have Steve Capitan. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you did. Hi, I'm Steve Capitan from the 3rd Ward, and I just wanted to share a brief background. I ran for City Council 24 years ago fighting City Hall on a TIF issue. This man sitting right here was the city manager at the time, and we had our disagreements, but I respected him then and I respect him now. I just wanted to mention that in my time on the council, I voted both for TIF issues and against TIF issues. I've recognized where I think they've been abused and where I think they've been effective. I think one thing that everybody should keep in mind on the JRB is that the intention of the TIF issue, of TIF, as you know, and never forget, is revitalization, economic revitalization of blighted areas. And keeping that in mind and in the forefront of your deliberation of what you're doing is important. And it's especially important for the city because the city takes on the responsibility of making those decisions. And I think it's appropriate that the city is in the position of making those decisions because the city is the taxing body that has the overall economic development of the city in mind and its responsibility. But it's an awesome responsibility to respect the fact that it's the other taxing bodies, especially the school district, whose money is being used for this purpose. And the city should never forget that as it is making its decisions about how to use TIF money. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. All right, moving on to item E, principle and structure of the JRB to assure public accountability, fiscal accountability, and public transparency. Mr. Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this on? Everybody can hear? Last time we looked very briefly at some amendments to the City Code, Chapter 737 amendments, and it's my impression that the board want to have a little more time to look at those, and so we're back with basically the same draft, but I wanted to highlight some of the changes that, or some of the points that the JRB in recent months has been particularly interested in. And I thought I'd go down those points, and you can tell me if you think these are agreeable, and then we can make any changes that you direct. Now these amendments are actually to the municipal code. They wouldn't be a JRB document, but they would represent the sense of this body and would be represented to the council in that fashion. So let's start at the top. In your background for today's meeting, there was a couple page report from me. We'll start at the top. I believe that we're of one mind on the regularity of the JRB meetings, which we had proposed to be on a quarterly basis to start with, and we'll see how that goes. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that? Okay. Also, to give you a chance, particularly where there are financial reports that might be more detailed, give you a chance to make thoughtful decisions. I've proposed that these meetings should receive, or you should receive packets 10 days in advance of each JRB meeting. And as a practical matter, what you'd be getting would be, if you wanted to see the 3 trailing months, it would probably, depending on when the JRB meeting is in a month, it might be the 1 month in arrears. It's just, it really would depend on when we had scheduled the meeting. But we'd have to wait till the last month basically had cleared. Does anybody have a problem with that? You mind if I go down?
No, please continue.
All right. The draft ordinance that you looked at last week and over the last week calls for the televising of these meetings. This is the second meeting since we've renewed our work, and last week was televised. This one's televised. I think it's a good idea. What do you think? Okay. Project performance. So we had some discussion about that last time. The amendments to the municipal code draw attention to the need to be able to track the progress of various projects that are receiving TIF funding or are occurring in our TIF district. A lot of that information in that section has to do with the council's attention to these projects, and if I remember correctly, the board thought there seemed to be a consensus that you were not interested in delving down into whether the building coming out of the ground, for instance, was in tune exactly with the plans, but you were more concerned about the fiscal impact, the financial impact, and the development importance. Is that correct?
Well, that's my position,
Okay.
and I
Anybody
don't want to
else?
speak for the entire group.
Gary?
Well, this, here on number 4 here, it seems to me it's mixing two topics, and one is looking at the performance, and I agree we don't need to see whether it's compliance. That's to me an administrative function. But the second part of this, whether a worthy project in terms of overall goals of the TIF district really isn't to performance, it's to prior approval.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel it would
Okay.
be important to have at least input in it, whether we talk about maybe not taking a vote or whatever, but it seems like that'd be the chance to opine on whether something is an appropriate use.
Okay, so which one was that, Gary?
Number 4, and if you look at the second to
Yeah.
last sentence, or part of it, it says a worthy project in terms of the overall goals of the TIF district.
Right.
And it just seemed like that's different than a performance item.
So to clarify, you're saying that that's really 2 points, because one of them is this body would be looking at projects before council is approving them, and then the second part would be looking at their performance after the building comes out of the ground, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's why it's 2 different points.
Yes, and I have not interest in whether it's performing. Well, I care, but that's not my role. But I do think input into whether it's a good project or not is certainly, that's talking about an investment of our tax dollars, so it'd be nice to have some comfort level of that.
And that would be the in advance of council approval of a project you want to review and hear a report, some demonstration of why the city staff feel that's going to be meeting the
You
objectives
talk
of
about
the
return
TIF.
on investment, and
Yeah.
there's sometimes you can quantify that and sometimes you can't, but it just seems like that's part of the
Okay.
discussion that should happen.
Amy?
Sorry, for clarification, are you suggesting that this body would then have a vote on, each of those projects, whether it's kind of a thumbs up or thumbs down, or simply this would be the place where each entity, if they were to so choose, would give their opinion? So
Yeah.
this would be the opportunity for the county to comment, but not necessarily the JRB to take a vote.
Whether we voted or not, to me, doesn't matter because it's only advisory anyway. So I'm fine with just voice and no vote, but I think if we don't have a place to articulate it, we're stuck with coming to a council meeting at the 0 hour and enunciating our concerns. And it just seems like this would be a better forum to do that and get the clarification we need and hopefully prevent any last minute hard feelings, I guess.
So is it almost in our quarterly meetings that we would be provided some updates on possible projects, proposed projects, and again, to be able to give our input, but not being a voting body, again, like a zoning or zoning board,
Right.
where we're giving a recommendation to the city council. Just more of an, Mr. Johnson?
Go ahead and finish.
Or Johns, I'm sorry.
Johnson?
Go ahead.
We have 2 Johnsons at the table, it sounds like. I would suggest on number 1 then that maybe you want to include or as appropriate, not just quarterly meetings, but this quarterly might be too long of a time to wait. So perhaps there may be a reason like we meet 2 weeks in a row here to call a special meeting, if you will.
Could I just ask a clarifying question on that? Do you mean that we would sort of render an opinion as to whether the proposed project meets the stated intent of TIF in the first place, or whether we would offer an opinion on whether we like the project as an economic contributor?
Good question. What was the first choice?
You know, whether it meets the sort of stated intent of TIF so that we would just really be measuring that it, you know, checking the boxes to make sure that in fact it kind of, you know, is working toward the goals of TIF, or whether we feel like we don't want another restaurant like that in this town, or do you? It's a kind of a, it's an important distinction, I think.
It is, and I would hope projects wouldn't get this far unless it did meet all the legal criteria of the TIF district. So I'd probably have faith in that process. I think I could look back at a couple projects and wonder where it happened, but I'll give the faith going forward. But I would like to opine whether the economics of the project are beneficial to our taxing body, and obviously I would think you might have similar concerns, but I'm mostly concerned with the county. So more whether it's the financially a good investment, or from our opinion.
First, just to respond, Bob was laying out something different, and I think we should come back to that if we can, about the timing and so forth. And I would just offer the opinion that I think we'd have to reserve the right to meet as needed, because things, as Bob was saying, don't always line up on a quarterly basis, but that would be something for discussion here. But on Gary's point and your point, I agree. I'm already thinking how that report would look, and its titles, subtitles, and so forth. Obviously, anything that would be proposed would have to comply with the TIF Act, and then we're talking about TIF 3, and even in TIF 1, which is going to keep going for a few more years. And there is a redevelopment project area ordinance that approves it, whether to come or 20 years ago, and there are certain stated goals which are updated from time to time. There should be something we can hang the project on in terms of the broad goals for redevelopment in the area. And then the fiscal part, there ought to be some projection on our part for your benefit, for the council's benefit, for the community's benefit, to see what a projected flow of property tax might be, and then also what the incremental revenues might be, whether they're shared or not. And then sort of a scorecard, I guess, for every project. So we've got this many projects in the pipeline to kind of give you a progress report on how that particular project fits in with that scheme of things based on our list that we've already approved. Those things could go in that report. Do any of those sound out of sync with what you were thinking?
Well, no, I know we had discussions about this, and we had varying opinions on the level of input that we should have, and I respectfully, I don't know that I disagree, but my concern is that because we don't have sort of formal mechanisms for this, that suddenly we would be turned into another outlet for people in the community to either lobby for or against certain projects, and that, you know, we, as Amy mentioned last time, would sort of end up advising on the worthiness of projects based on desirability instead of
meeting criteria.
Economic soundness. And so I don't think it's impossible, but I think we do have to pick a lane, because I think the way we set ourselves up from here on out will be dramatically different based on those two.
And keeping in mind that at some point, not the same people are going to be sitting around and filling these chairs. So how we design this now is setting the stage for the future.
I have a comment. Part of what we're doing is trying to be more transparent to the community. And so I think there's a lot of value for the city to present to us what's in the pipeline, what's coming, maybe not necessarily to make decisions on, but at least to be aware of, and that way, because they're televised, the public is also advised on some of that. I agree, though, I think we need to be careful about what we're, you know, whether we're evaluating the project based on preference or whether it meets the TIF, and hopefully if it's in the pipeline, it already meets those requirements.
Can I offer that on point 1, that we agree that the JRB meetings shall be held on a quarterly basis or as appropriate or as needed? And under number 4, that it's included that the in the quarterly meetings or meetings as called, that we will receive updates on proposed and upcoming projects and a progress report to be discussed and reviewed. Again, I don't know that, I agree with Jennifer that I think we need to pick that lane, that there's a fine line between us being a review and approve board as opposed to a review and give input or give feedback. And I'm proposing that our lane is to review publicly and give feedback, just as the public can come and give feedback as well. That's the purpose of this committee.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Maybe it'd be helpful for people and young people at home who are watching this to just recall that there are several, as Gary was suggesting, there are several, and you were suggesting, there are several lanes here that aren't going to go away whether the JRB meets or not. If a project, take for instance the Mooney property, if there was a development scheme for that, there might be zoning considerations that would logically go to our Planning and Zoning Commission before they would ever get to the council for final review. The council makes a decision on those. If there is TIF funding associated with it, which is the tool that we're here to discuss, then, as Gary was suggesting, you will want to know that because those funds are held in trust, your trust of how we will use them, you will want to know what is the logical outcome of this in terms of the benefit to the community, benefit to your taxing body. So if we can keep in those lanes, I think we're doing what you just suggested. Is that would you say that's correct?
And then regarding what we sort of touched on in terms of the requirement for special meetings, would this be something that we would take in those sort of snapshot of the time period, or would this be in the interest of expediency? Every time a project comes forward, we'd be expected to convene and offer an opinion before that would make its way to council. I see a lot of meetings then in addition.
I think it just gives you the latitude to, as in, say, our city code, as in probably the township rules, you can call a meeting, a special meeting, if the majority of the board feel that's important. I'm not looking for more meetings. I don't know if anybody is, but there just may be that time. If we were to set out a schedule, for instance, meeting the first Friday of whatever month, 4 times a year, that may be months off of where an advisory committee might want to meet to talk about a particular project. Because we don't control it, many of these projects will be privately funded as well. We don't control all the pieces that go with that, so there might have to be some discussion. I think we maybe are wrestling this to the ground.
I agree.
I do have a question, then kind of goes back, I guess, to point number 2 about the financial reporting being available 10 days before the meeting. But then if there were projects that were on the agenda for us to discuss, would that information also be available 10 days
Yeah, I think we do just do the agenda 10 days
with the background material. Because many of us, there are taxing bodies that we represent that may also need to meet to discuss.
Yeah. I don't think we could do it more than 10 days, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I put it all together so you're not getting piecemeal information.
So it's not just the financial reporting, but it would also be information about the projects.
I can make that clear. Report including financials.
But if you were calling a special meeting, then it would be more project-specific as opposed to our quarterly meetings where we would expect, you know, more of the last quarter performance and, you know, all of those items we previously discussed.
Right. Here's one example of maybe an urgent meeting where this won't be in play much longer, but the airport would get funding from time to time from state government, federal government. Usually it was federal funds coming through the state IDOT and so forth, and it is not unusual for there to be last-minute changes. They want something and it changes the flavor, maybe the location, or maybe the potential impact, and we'd want to let you know that. I guess you could decide whether you wanted to meet or not, but you would be advised if nothing else.
So it sounds like the meetings would be quarterly, and then if for some reason there was a needed meeting, we would have it, but it wouldn't necessarily be dozens of meetings a year. You don't foresee that?
It couldn't be, or I'd become the city manager of the JRB, and the mayor would have to look for another one.
Well, and again, keep in mind that we're collectively trying to create something that, you know, under, if you, and I left it on the printer, the Joint Annual Review Board for TIF, we're taking this, you know, into, you know, quarterly meetings and creating something that really isn't outlined statutorily. So, you know, we're collectively making this our own. Okay. Bill, can we move on to...
Right, 5.
5, please.
Right. This was an easy one. I just assume you want to know in particular how administrative expenses of various kinds are being recorded and reported, and that would be part of the financials.
And maybe this is something that we'll cover later when we talk about the IGA. Was there a proposed cap on administrative expenses or a % of the projects, or was that left out?
We had, it's not in here. We had talked about that, though, in some of the JRB meetings last fall. I think if we're meeting and giving you our reports on a quarterly basis, you can track that pretty carefully, whereas before it would have been a year's worth of expenses and it was too late to make comment or suggestions accordingly. So.
Thoughts?
My recollection was that we discussed it and moved away from it because it would be too difficult to, in years where there's a lot of potential development, it would be setting us up, or setting the city up to blow it,
right,
because there'd be, right out of the gate, whereas obviously in slower years meeting a percentage cap would be easier. But we don't want that to be the case. We would like there to be a lot of potential development.
Right.
That was my recollection.
So we don't want to create a barrier that's going to stand in the city's way.
Yeah.
Right.
Also, that directive that I handed out last time tended to tighten the parameters for expensing certain costs, and I hope if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, please do. Hopefully that helps too.
Other thoughts before we move away from this topic? Item 6, please.
Infrastructure expenses. So we've had some discussion about this, and I'd like your thoughts. A couple ways we could approach this. There are some who would say there is no standalone infrastructure maintenance project that should ever be approved. There are some who would say that it makes some sense where a private property development that needs new water connections, sewer connections, and so forth, where the underground infrastructure is a part of the TIF project, that should nearly in all cases be approved because it's eligible. And then there are probably variations of those too. I weighed in here a little bit. I think there are times where, depending on, it all is about the condition of the infrastructure in the TIF district, in particular around areas that are begging for redevelopment. I think there are some times where you're going to sponsor redevelopment by doing some of that infrastructure work. And I'm not talking about minimal things like putting up Christmas lights and crack filling. I'm talking about, for instance, if you've been marketing, somebody's been marketing a parcel for years, and it's clear that the curbs are broken, the road is alligatored, the sidewalk is hardly passable for persons who are not able-bodied and able to traverse it. All those things, if you're on the private side of the discussion, you're thinking, I got to do all this before I do the building. And I think we have to at least allow for the possibility, it would have to be reviewed, this body would review along with the council the merit for and the TIF worthiness, but I would hate to see that ruled out. And as we look at where TIF 3 is, and I think everybody got a chance to see the map that was sent to you, this blow-up actually obscures the actual size of where, and you can see where it is. There's a lot of turf there that's surrounded by some old infrastructure. So if you were to build a structure that requires sprinkling, for instance, and you're dealing with a 80, 100-year-old main, we had a number of those blow up on us this week, as you know. That's something that would be a disincentive to redevelopment. So I'd just like to leave that open.
I got a question. With it,
yes, Mark.
Are you discussing like standalone infrastructure projects? Right, so not related to a particular TIF project.
Right. I think the easier case can be made for something connected to a project. Cornerstone, for instance, there's some underground infrastructure involved there. But the standalone, I think there will be an occasion or two where we want to look at that. What I think we'll do, as we have some time here, is to come up with a list, I guess you would say, with some rough estimates of cost and how that would figure in and what a project design might be. I'll probably need 3 months, 6 months to do this in TIF 3 as an example, but I think we can come up with that, and you can say, yeah, we're on the right track, or no, I don't think this is sensible.
But Bill, what you're describing are expenses and projects that are within the TIF Act, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of something you can't do anymore. You can't pave a road to a flag lot, which is what we did in the original TIF 1. Sycamore, Gary will remember this. Sycamore Road was basically reconstructed. It was a great project for the community, but it wasn't tied to any TIF project, and it went all the way up to Bethany and Route 23, and it was tied to what used to be a motel, and there was a big retention pond there. Now Johnny's is just north of that, and there's a small commercial subdivision there. But that kind of project I'm not speaking of here, but it's something that's proximate to the land area that is in the proposed TIF 3. That would make sense.
I don't see where standalone infrastructure projects are any different than any other TIF project that are ultimately under the purview of the city to discern whether its worthiness. And I don't see where this body has any more, well, certain people excluded would have any of the requisite expertise on that than we would on anything else. And if it's something that meets the criteria, oh, you too, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit.
I can't see ours.
We hope.
Yeah, you don't want to see it. You don't want to see it. All right, thank you.
How do you distinguish between what should be charged to TIF and what should be charged to your general fund? That's
great
like
question.
a
great question.
Gray area.
Yeah, and that's why I think we're having this discussion. There's a lot of gray here. I would say this: if there was to be a standalone, I'm not talking about a water main repair or something like that, but a standalone project that involved the installation of X feet of water main that also brings stubs into the redevelopment area, for instance. That'd be fair game. I bring it to you. That'd be one of the projects we list, and you could say, I like all 5 of these, and number 6 out. That's why you have a water fund, or that's why you have. The way I could make a case on that would be, yeah, we have the water fund, and we've been. This has been on a list for 20 years, and it's never been done. And we've had a number of businesses that have looked at this site and left because they want to see that there's going to be a commitment there somehow. So we'd have to make the case. I'm spinning hypothetical.
It's almost goes back to the whole but for. This property or this area is not developing because of this, and but for using TIF dollars, it's not going to develop. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
No, and I do believe, though, it would be on a per-case basis, whether you have to increase a water main.
Yeah.
If you have a 100-year-old water main, then the industry standard calls for them to be changed out every 50 years. Yeah. I do believe the city should have to incur some of those costs. Mm-hmm. But to make sidewalks ADA compliant in order, and to help the developer in that way, or to increase a water main or a sanitary sewer or storm sewer, to allow a larger building to go on that piece of property, or to help retain water, I think that is something that should fall under the review of TIF.
Stormwater is another thing. Sometimes the retention that has a more than a one lot impact, but it can help a neighborhood, help a whole area of town. So,
well, back to one of our citizens who addressed the board. If this is, if the intent of the TIF district is to revitalize parts of the town that are blighted or otherwise not growing, and if a water main or storm water, if that's what we need to get that part of town going, then I think it would have to be a consideration.
Okay. But the but-for rule, I guess, if we come out of this discussion with anything, that's pretty much what applies here, that this wasn't getting done and won't get done but for some TIF investment. Is that correct? Okay.
Before,
one last.
I have a different point on that, so I don't want to mix the two. So I'm fine with where we're at on that, but I don't want to leave the point. So I make sure everybody else is done.
I'm ready to move on.
Okay. Well, there's this item about the opinion of the majority of the JRB, and I think that comes right down to the where this gets tricky on what the law says the JRB is and what we're creating here, and it goes to, in the ordinance under 3703F, it talks about taxing bodies have the right to participate, but they're non-voting, and so we're kind of mixing two things together, and that's fine. I just think we got to clarify when we're doing advice and opinions, everybody is part of that, but when we're fulfilling a statutory role, then we got to make it clear, because even establishing the quorum you got to watch what you're doing. That's all I'm saying. The language needs to be really clear on that.
Okay. Point taken.
Which kind of connects back to our first question of what will we be asked to weigh in on and how. If we're asked to weigh in opinion-wise, there's nothing to tally, I suppose. If we're just saying, if Craig's able to say, from my expertise, in infrastructure, here's what I think. But I think it was stated last time that he wouldn't have an official vote on the JRB. So,
I think the only thing the JRB actually votes on is a recommendation on a TIF district.
Yeah.
But this language is talking about a vote
per project
That
basis.
sets in motion a 2/3 city council action. So that's the one I think
That's
has
the
got to be
creation of the TIF, isn't it? Or
No, I don't.
No,
It was,
that might be more than we're looking for at this point.
it might be, but it's in this language about a 2/3 vote. This, if we didn't recommend, I can't remember.
If you
what
chose
it-
not to recommend a project, it would take,
An infrastructure project, I think that's
Yeah.
what it is. So, and maybe that'll all go away.
well,
when we do the
part of,
final
I think
draft,
part of
but-
the issue here is that the amendments were following some direction from the council, because the council was being sensitive to the fact that there are concerns about the use of TIF dollars for standalone projects. And so to fund such a project, the thinking was, I'm getting this secondhand, but the thinking was to have a supermajority vote.
It's in 3706B.
So I don't
So
think
if that could get
it
cleaned
wasn't.
up.
Yeah, it wasn't meant. We'll clean it up. It wasn't meant that the JRB would be voting on that.
Say 3706B?
Yeah. But
If we go-
Oh,
as I said at
Towards
the
the
outset,
bottom of
these amendments were made to direct city staff and city council actions, and we're using that as a springboard toward understanding in general what the JRB wants to do.
Well, but it also reads, the city may present such project to the JRB for affected TIF district. If the majority of the members of the property convene, JRB meetings support utilization of TIF funds for some or all portion of the project which purely involves city infrastructure, the city may proceed utilizing TIF funds. Where do you see the 2/3 vote on this?
I'll have to reread it. Unless the author of this document knows offhand.
But when we start getting into 2/3 vote by the city council, again, aren't we now operating like the zoning and planning board?
Exactly. Maybe are we going to get a new draft?
So I
Maybe
think
that'll
we're
work
going to
out.
get a new draft. I just want to go over these general points with
Okay.
you.
And I'm sorry
No.
to take us off in the weeds here, but if a new TIF district were being proposed and then the Joint Annual Review Board does make a recommendation.
Makes a recommendation, correct.
And if the recommendation is not to approve a TIF district, then I believe it's a 2/3
That's correct.
vote by the city council.
That's
But
correct. We're not
only
talking about
only in
individual
that case.
projects.
Thank
Right.
you. But Gary, thank you for bringing that point up. We want to make sure that we're being consistent
Right.
in writing with what we're proposing.
It might have been in the IGA, but anyway, moot point at this point.
Mr. Nicholas, I believe we're
Last
to
point.
point 7.
Yeah, ROI. So I've heard the board say that that's interesting and important to you, so we would have to write some language for that. So maybe what we'll do, we've been sort of slaves to a proposed ordinance that is geared toward council action. Maybe we ought to create a new document that is going to be the sense of the JRB with respect to all these points. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of
we'll-
becomes your rules of engagement going forward.
So will you
we
draft
can do
that
that, yeah.
and push it out to us before our next meeting, and hopefully at that point we can
Yes.
review once again.
Is it
and
next
make-
week? Well, we'll find out later.
Next Friday, I'm not here. We can
Okay.
review again and
We'll get it
and
done.
hopefully approve.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other items for E?
No.
Okay. We will move on our agenda to item F, intergovernmental agreement between taxing bodies related to proposed central business TIF which is TIF 3.
So we were going to talk about a draft IGA. And as I was thinking about that earlier in the week, it occurred to me that before we spin a draft, it would be useful to know the JRB's feeling about what the objectives of that would be, particularly with respect to projects, the possibility of a surplus distribution as we've had with TIF 1, and as we agreed to do at the end, at the close of TIF 2. And in thinking about that and talking with our city staff, a novel idea arose that doesn't pit projects versus surplus, and that was described in your background, and basically gets down to this, that as we were looking and spreading, there were a couple of longer spreadsheets at your desk here today. As we were looking at what would happen if we, for example, were to pick up an idea that was circulated back in November amongst JRB members about the possibility in TIF 3 doing a surplus, beginning that surplus at 30% of the increment in any given year in the 4th year, and then rising to 50% in the 8th year. And I'll recall that. So I decided, let's spin this out, looking as best we can. We have no crystal ball, but at where we'd be, and we just went out 16 years or so here, just to show you magnitude of numbers. And there are some estimates of what the revenue would be, and then what the surplus might be. So those are numbers, right? In your background, I did a simpler chart, not quite as busy. It has 3 columns. The middle column contemplates that tiered distribution that I just described to you. On the right is where we'd be if we closed down TIF 1 year early. You get the lump sum very close to what you'd have to wait 16 years to get right up front. And it's not that we don't have projects and things to do in TIF 1, but this is, I'll tell you, the advantage to the city, frankly, and we would also, see some money, but the advantage to the city primarily is that we'd be able to focus on loading up projects early in the top part and the early years of the TIF, and just focus on that, and we might be able to constructively come to the conclusion after 10 or 12 years we've knocked it out of the park, we're done. Mm-hmm. So that's not been the practice around here, but it's not unusual in other places. TIF is presumed to produce certain results, and if we could hit those results and we're aggressive about it, then we might get the best of both approaches. So I was wondering if you've had a chance to think about that. It's all in the numbers, and these numbers are, of course, speculative to some extent, but we're pretty conservative here. We only added a 2% increase in the EAV in the district, the proposed TIF district, over time, and a pretty flat property tax rate for each of the taxing bodies. And in terms of Cornerstone and Plaza DeKalb, we had picked what we call a median projected EAV for those coming on.
Because they haven't been fully assessed yet, correct?
Right, so they come on in about 2 to 3 years now.
Well, I'll jump in. I like the idea of ending TIF 1 early and not have all the surpluses to deal with in TIF 3. I like the simplicity of it, and I actually think if we follow that through and we get this Chapter 37 refined a little bit, we don't need an IGA. I think that could just go by the wayside, and I like that as well. I'm not sure this goes quite far enough in the dollars back to the entities. And one of the things, and I lifted this out to you a couple days ago, was the sales tax issue. We still have that where the state received some of the surplus over the last couple of years. Particularly, there's been a lot of debate whether they should have it or not. And and I would hate to, if we could change how we do it so they don't get the sales tax, and if the city would pursue trying to recover the money they just sent them and got them cash the check, I think some of that would better even out where we're at on this. I note that the projections here are conservative, which is probably wise, but they're drastically different than the SB Friedman report, which was very aggressive.
Predicted 85 million.
But there's no protection for us should those projections be good.
Yes.
But I guess if they're that good, we'd all be winners because ultimately the assessed value would go up. I just think we could fine-tune this a little bit and accomplish what you're suggesting by closing out TIF 1.
I want to thank Gary. He did respond to this, was it Wednesday night or early Thursday morning, something like that.
I was frozen in. So.
Yeah, they were. And so we did some more figuring. And I didn't want to bury you with numbers. And Jason and Ray and Dean and I have been working on numbers for the last 2 days. And we've had 11 by 17 size spreadsheets. And I wanted to get it down to what should be at your desk. Do you see these smaller? There's a probably black and white. I think it's on top there. Is that it? Yep. Everybody see that? Bob, you got it. So I'm going to start this, and if I should get out of my depth here, I will seek help. But I learned in this process about the sales tax distribution that had occurred long after I was formerly city manager, and so some of this was new to me, and some of this will be new to you today. So, as you know, the city of DeKalb had the opportunity in the early years of TIF 1 to get both sales tax increment and property tax increment. And the sales tax increment was broken down into two pieces: this SROT, which is the acronym for the State Retailers Occupation Tax, and the MROT, which doesn't have that acronym anymore, but the Municipal Retailers Occupation Tax. That was the city's portion. So a 5% and a 1% portion. You still with me? Okay. So that was being accrued, and it was all going to the city of DeKalb until the 2007 agreement set off a time frame from 2011, 2012, 2013, where that would be shared with the other taxing bodies. And then after 2013, and you see an asterisk in the left chart. At 2014, it goes through 2018. And I tried to stick with the numbers we know, and I wasn't projecting out what would happen after this year. Interestingly, I learned this week that the TIF Act has a provision relating to surplus that basically says, even though there is no more sales tax accruing increment, there still is a distribution as if that was accruing, and it's going to come to you in the form of property tax dollars. It's going to increase that, what's going to be shared. So although the chart shows SROT and MROT continuing, those are sort of phantoms. They're real numbers. But if you look over to the right, that was the total of the increment. So those three columns add up to the one on the right. Okay? Are you still with me? Not losing you? All right. The table on the left is what was supposed to happen based on Section 7 of the TIF Act. The table on the right is what did happen. So actually, all of us got a little more than we otherwise would have received. The city of DeKalb received a little more than the little more that you received. Because of a miscalculation, or not a miscalculation, but an interpretation of the TIF Act which we don't hold to anymore. So that's where we are. That is, so far as I know, the truest numbers that we have on the sales tax piece of the distribution once it was to be shared with the other taxing bodies. And you can keep this and study it and review it with your staff and your board. But that's the money that basically either has gone out or could go out.
Going out in what fashion? How was that distributed?
It would have been distributed with your annual distribution.
From the county
Yes.
assessor?
Yes. I didn't break it down into each pocket here. I just wanted to put the total.
Yep.
I need clarification. Are you saying,
Sure.
let's take the state, they got more or less than they were supposed to?
Yes. Oh, more or less?
Yeah.
I believe, and Dean, you can help me with this, I believe the state, we had some discussion, I wasn't part of that discussion here in recent months, and the Department of Revenue, after some discussion, agreed that they were to have received that distribution. Is that correct? You can come up here, Dean.
I guess my question is, should they gotten the $3,715,000 or should they gotten the $4,135,000? And which did they get?
They would have gotten on the right. They would have gotten the $4 million.
And they should have gotten $3,700,000.
That's correct.
So we should ask them for that money.
Well, come on up.
Sorry.
Dean.
But you're saying we also got more.
You go ahead. So the question is, from Gary, looking at this, it looks like the state received more than the statutory process would have called for. Is that correct?
Yes, the state received more than the strict interpretation of Section 7 contemplates. All of the taxing districts received more than what Section 7 contemplates. And I think a significant contributing factor to that was the 2007 IGA has an exhibit attached to it that has a sample calculation for how the surplus is to be calculated. But that exhibit doesn't actually follow the statute. So while the IGA references the specific section of the statute, it then provides a sample calculation that isn't consistent. The recommendation is to strictly follow Section 7. We've reviewed that with the Department of Revenue staff attorneys in detail, and we've talked about the interpretation of the statute and their understanding of it. And the column on the left would be the recommendation prospectively.
But what has been done is likely to stay done, in your opinion.
I don't know what their perspective would be on refunding that. I think it is, given our past discussions, somewhat unlikely, but I don't have a good way of answering that.
Can I ask a question? So if the state received more than they should have, but also each of these entities also received more than we should have from the TIF funds. So if the state were to return the funds, would then the expectation be that each of these bodies return those funds as well? I don't know if anyone can answer that, but I'm asking that question.
Let me just offer an opinion. I don't practice law with a license, but I would say that given the track record here, this state would, or any other taxing body would point out if one had a return, then maybe others should, or if none did, then that's maybe. So I would suggest that we think prospectively and not try to settle this.
Unless we all returned it, and then as TIF 2, when TIF 2 closes,
TIF 1.
or TIF 1, thank you, it all gets redistributed.
Or the city could surplus it at any time, right? We could return it, and then the city could
there's
surplus it?
maybe another way here. Are you ready? I don't know how you are sitting with your budgets, but these are some real dollars. I don't know how what kind of a hole that would leave for you. I know it would leave a significant hole for the city of DeKalb. So another way to look at this would be to, again, the numbers are significant, but probably not out of reach. We could possibly look again at the TIF 1 denouement, the end of the TIF 1, and just as we're looking at the other option, find if there is a difference out of that.
Can you repeat that?
Going forward, going forward.
So, and I guess I have two questions to that. One would be to Gary's point. If the state has some of the money that belongs in the TIF, shouldn't we pursue that, getting it back if we can do so? But then, I guess, and if not,
well, then everybody would have to give it back.
Can I offer one other slight note that might help with this issue a little bit? There's nothing in the TIF Act, so assuming you have projects to fund and you're moving forward happily, there's nothing saying you're required to declare surplus. And the reason the city declares a 50% surplus from TIF 1 since 2011 is because of the IGA. On the other hand, there's nothing in the TIF Act saying that you can't declare as much surplus as you want. So the city could conceivably get to a given year and say, we're going to declare everything in the TIF surplus. What happened here, if you look at the columns, the total amount that was distributed, so for FY11, the city's calculation is about 3.46 million should have been distributed. Instead, 4.156 was distributed. Mm-hmm. So in essence, the city paid more surplus than it was required to under the 2007 IGA. That doesn't necessarily mean that the TIF Act was violated or that anyone owes money back. It just means that the city paid more surplus than they strictly would have. So they could have retained that money and used it for projects. Instead, they paid it out of surplus.
Good point.
Okay.
So, here we are.
So let's go back, Bill, to the different options.
Yes.
Yeah, option 1, 2, and I believe 3.
And 3, right. The 2 and 3 are on the legal size spreadsheets. One of them just shows the method that we had talked about last fall with a 30% surplus distribution from the 4th year through the 7th year, and then a 50% distribution from the 8th year onward. And the other spreadsheet that has a lot of blanks on it would be using the same assumptions, a 2% annual increase and so forth, waiting until we had more power in the TIF, I don't think you'll like this, but in the TIF district. So we hit about $1 million threshold in annual increment, and then we would 50% surplus it. And if nothing else, it just shows the difference in what would be in the pot, so to speak, for projects over that period of time.
And you're projecting that date to be 2034?
Who knows? I mean, it could be 20. It'd be great if it was 2025, you know, that we'd hit it. But whenever we'd hit it, that would be when it would trigger the sharing.
So that's option 1.
That's actually option 3.
What
I just said. Yeah. And option 2 was going back to the format that we had talked about last fall. And option 1 was the new alternative, which was the idea of closing down TIF 1 a year early and distributing that, which is roughly comparable to the first 16 years of TIF 3, with a very conservative projection.
So option 1 is the bird in the hand, two in the bush.
Yep. Okay.
I agree with Gary, though, that the simplicity of it, or the more simple way of viewing this from in a holistic sense of not having to worry about the distributions for 3 is nice. I also think that, looking at these projections that, we had a lot of discussion around the idea of surplus, and it's sort of being outside of the common usage of TIF. And, there just isn't, I think the city was responsive to some of the concerns of TIF, really shrunk down the TIF, eliminated a lot of residences out of it, and that's just not going to yield increment at the same rate that was available before. So I think if we want to have this be a TIF, if we're going to do a TIF, it seems to make the most sense to me to have it have the most teeth that it can without diluting it with surplus distributions to all of us. Having it go into the pot for more development is, I think, going to make a much swifter impact. And I mean, that's the hope. And, like you said, if we have 7 or 8 years of just boom and growth, then we can shut it down and not have to talk about 23-year projections. So I know there's a lot to be sorted out then with TIF 1, but it sounds like we can crunch those numbers and figure that out.
This is all new to you, so I thought we would put it up today and have some conversation around it. We can play with some numbers. You'll have a chance to study it. We can come back at the next meeting, and I assume we're going to have another meeting. So we'll have to talk about the first topic on the agenda again, and then the numbers.
Could I ask a question about option 1? And maybe it's more information from the staff when we meet again, but what are the, I guess, what would be the impact? Are there projects being considered in TIF 1 that we're looking at eliminating? And not that we necessarily need to get into those specific projects, but then the flip side of that is why wait until 2021 to end TIF 1? Is there any consideration given towards ending it sooner?
Well, we do have projects, and the council will have a chance. I don't want to get ahead of the council. The mayor and council will consider the ordinance that would adopt TIF 3 on second reading on the 11th. It was approved on first reading, and then it was tabled until there'd be more discussion, as you know. So bringing that back, and part of the reason is what we talked about the last time about the need to, if we're going to proceed with it, and I think the general feeling is we should proceed with TIF 3 here anyway, we have to do it before the reassessments are completed. So yeah, that's, so if TIF 3 goes ahead, we've got projects to do in TIF 1, and TIF 3, the most obvious ones over in TIF 3, which could start right now, might be Shodine. That's a big part of the redevelopment area in TIF 3. That could start long before we get any increment coming out of TIF 3. It's in TIF 1 we could do it. So
I'm still a little confused. So the number that we're talking about surplusing out from TIF 1 contemplates going ahead with the projects that you've already earmarked, or not going with those projects?
So what we're looking at here is to try to, there was interest in surplus, and rather than taking surplus out of TIF 3, let's take it out of the last year of TIF 1. That's basically the bottom line.
But you've already earmarked some of the money that's in the pot for projects, right? So if we shut it down early, are we talking about doing that in lieu of those projects, or going ahead with the projects that have already been earmarked? Okay, yeah. And then at the end, okay, got it.
And these figures recollect those with those projects? So.
And the figures in this box, under option 1, those numbers are built in?
Here, yes.
Okay. And the FY22 revenue?
Yes.
And that would be not surplus revenue, but property tax revenue,
That's
correct?
right.
In that, what we're
well,
contemplating here.
It's property tax, not sales tax, right? You said surplus, didn't you?
Yes, I said, so what we're
It's
contemplating
property
is
tax.
that it isn't a surplus payment from the
Right.
city out of the TIF. It would be capturing that property, each entity would be capturing the property tax a year earlier
Yes.
than otherwise
Yes.
contemplated.
I think I understood your question.
I think I understand too.
Okay.
I'll come back to trying to increase the dollars that, because part of what happened, or the impetus for some of this, is that Cornerstone and Sundog, and I think there's actually
Right.
2 other properties, have already utilized TIF money, and now we're not going to see that value. So that was part of the discussion of why we wanted to capture some of that money. So again, I'm still for stopping TIF 1 a year early. I think that's good, but I think to bring a little more money into the fold, a couple ways of doing it is to pay for the proposed hotel project, whether it happens or not, out of TIF 1, because that puts more money into the final distribution out of TIF 2, and I think that would help offset forgoing surpluses out of TIF 3. A second way of possibly doing it is what, probably to Dean's point a little bit, is you could surplus more money in the final actual year of TIF 1. Instead of 50%, which is required on the IGA, you could go to 65 or 70, and that'd be another way of doing it. I just don't like that the state would get more money out of that. So.
Bill? Dean?
To Mr. Hansen's point, if we're looking for an eloquent way of providing for a greater distribution from TIF 1, I think the recommendation would be not collect increment in 2022, end the TIF prior to what everyone has been anticipating. It wouldn't be to collect that increment and surplus out 100%, because that would then, as you indicated, that would send money to the state. It would result in another sales tax payment to the city. It would be to simply end it sooner, not collect increment, and everyone recovers their increment that much faster. And I believe that's the calculation the city manager was presenting.
No, I was already stopping a year earlier, but I was trying to get a little more plus that. So my suggestion was into the year early of TIF ending.
So you're contemplating both ending it a year early and increasing the surplus by more than 50%?
Correct. Or
for year
just move the hotel project to TIF 1, and that'd be to me a cleaner way of doing it.
Is the hotel, the hotel project, is that Fisk?
Yes.
Yes, 145 Fisk.
Okay.
So, on behalf of the county, Gary has a suggestion on the table. I think what I'm hearing, and I talked to Jamie about this on the walk-in, that he wanted to have a little more time to look at the numbers. The rest of you want to have a little more time to look at the numbers. There may be another proposal, if you'd be willing to hold this over. Or, you know, certainly anybody else can suggest something, but let's get them out, record them, they'll be in the minutes. Thank you, Ruth. And then when we come back, I'll list them as they are reported. Would that be agreeable?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Other thoughts here on options 1, 2, or 3?
Just at the college, I've talked to Dr. Borowitz today. We would be generally supportive of the concept of making life simpler in TIF 3 and having 1 year, and if you can sweeten the pot, that's fine with us. But the concept of closing out the first TIF a year early, and then we're responsible for the funds, and we don't have to worry about waiting 20 years and what might happen or could happen.
Thank you.
And I haven't had a conversation with board members yet. We have a meeting Tuesday night. This will be on the agenda for discussion. Other thoughts on options 1, 2, or 3 before we move to schedule our next meeting?
And just one final question for Bill. Would you see if we could, do you think we could eliminate having an IGA? Is that a realistic possibility?
What is that?
Is it realistic to think we would not need an IGA?
Yeah, it's realistic. It's the pleasure of the body. It's realistic. We want to memorialize what we come up with at the next meeting in some fashion, wouldn't you think? Rather than, because I don't know about you, but just this amount of numbers, if we walk out of here, we'll have probably
absolutely.
eight recollections of what it was. So, but that could be done without an IGA. It could just be, and we could sign off. We could just print it up and just say at the meeting on whatever it was determined. Well, that's not quite an intergovernmental agreement. It's a sort of a sense of the body.
I just think if the city puts that Chapter 37 in place with refinements, that takes care of a lot of it.
That takes care of that piece. And then the second piece today, I guess that's up to you and to the rest of the board, how you want to proceed.
And again, that will be discussed at our next meeting.
Right.
All right, speaking of next meeting.
Before we get to that, since we're talking about distributions, I have it on good authority that the distribution that we have talked about from TIF 2 will be released, and the county collector will have it in his or her hands by, looking right, Tuesday, midweek, probably Wednesday. It turns out I frankly wanted to surprise you and have checks to hand out, make a deal.
We can wait.
Yeah. Well, it happens that we try to make some interest on our money, and we had our money, the money in question, tied up in an instrument. We didn't want to take a big penalty, so we bought a week of time here. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, item G, next meeting. We seem to have been lucky on Fridays. Unfortunately, I'm out of town next Friday. How is, do we want to look at Friday the 15th or try to go earlier in that week of the 11th?
Oh, just from the town board perspective, I won't have a chance to convey a lot of this to them until after our board meeting, so the 15th would work. Earlier than that, we won't have had a meeting, so it might get a little trickier getting input. But obviously, we will, if it works for everyone else, we'll find a way. But that's just my 2 cents.
Would you prefer to go into the week of the 18th?
No, I think, because our meeting, I think, is on the 13th. So the 15th would work.
Okay.
Earlier than that gets a little trickier.
Amy?
It's a no school day. I'm bringing my kids. No, I'm just kidding. That works fine.
We don't meet till the 19th, but our exec committee meets Tuesday morning, so
Okay.
I think we can get a sense of where we would be. So the 15th would work.
Okay.
We meet the 13th.
All right. Is that all right with you?
Yes, and the Forest Preserve.
I'm sorry?
Forest Preserve.
Yes.
So meeting on the 15th. At 2, is this a good time? 2 o'clock?
It is for me.
Is that all right?
I think, I don't know, apparently we don't have school that day.
It's an institute day. You might be occupied. It's an institute day. That's what it says on my calendar.
It's a holiday week.
I'll make it, I can make it work.
Okay.
There could be a blizzard, too.
Yeah, just saying.
Okay, then we are scheduled for
All right. We have some work to do.
the February 15th at 2 p.m. With that,
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
all in favor, aye?
Aye.
All right, thank you. We stand adjourned.
Thank you. Good meeting.
3:20.